Greetings to you graduates, families, and friends. It's a special occasion for this great achievement that you have. In thinking when I was asked to give this presentation today, first words that came to my mind was a quotation from a great novel written by Charles Dickens, The Tale of Two Cities, that was written about the time of the Great Revolution prior in France, the mid-1800s. And I won't quote the whole quotation, but the part that I will roast through, and I'm sure all of you have heard it. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And that goes on and on. My generation has started out, I was born beginning of the Great Depression, early 30s. And beginning with the hard times we had then, which was the worst times we'd had until we came to now. We had World War II, and by that time, the immigrants that come to this great open land, the land of opportunity, the land of freedom, with the hope to better their children, to better their lives, to have an opportunity for something special. And with this great land opening up, with the climate we had, the great land, tremendous agricultural possibilities, some much better than most of the rest of the world, and the eventual industrial revolution that we we took part in. This country gradually, at the end of World War II, became the greatest power on earth at the time. And the prosperity that came to us after World War II, we were the last ones standing without damage, so to speak, have the capacity to help the Western world and produce the goods that the rest of the world needed. We became very wealthy, very prosperous. So that was my generation. Lived in the best of all times, maybe the best of all time in the history of all civilization. Now, we're facing deep concerns about the future. We've got individuals, cities, counties, state, and federal government all in debt, all wondering what's happening, how it happened. In Europe, the euro, the great common experiment, is in trouble because frankly, it was all predictable. I lived there in the late 50s, watched it develop, and it was designed in a manner that almost guaranteed they were going to have problems because they didn't have a common discipline with different governments. The Middle East was created with a great unholy alliance. We talk about supporting democracy in the world, but we forgot it when we traded an unholy agreement to support certain people in exchange for cheap oil. So we've gradually created a problem here that we all know about, and now we're facing the other side of it, the best of times and the worst of times. More than 60 years ago, I entered college, started my engineering degree, and I don't remember a lot of the details. Certainly the technical knowledge that you have today surpasses anything that I had in my time or developed. But I remember one thing that I've never forgotten, the definition of good engineering. And that is, first obvious, something that works. You build it, and it's got to stand up and survive, provide the function. But the second and third points is what's really significant. It's the definition, and it's important, things I'm going to talk about today. The second and third qualifications are the lowest short-term and long-term costs. Not just short-term, but the total picture of the life of the project. And that's good design. That's what we're taught in engineering, whether you've ever heard that or not. It's still what you've been taught, black and white, how to do these things. A few economic and historical facts I'd like to go over. No great great nation on the face of the earth that developed and rose to power and wealth was ever destroyed from within. It was destroyed. They destroyed themselves from without. Or it was destroyed from without. They destroyed themselves from within. Moral decay, sense of entitlement, living beyond their means, overreach, developing a soft, lazy society with great expectations and little effort. Does that sound familiar? There's a saying in English economics, that you know England was over the 1800s became the country with the greatest power at that time. The sun never set on the English flag. And they have a saying in economics that you must maintain an export balance of power to maintain wealth. Now, what does that mean? That means that you basically bring in goods, add value, and you sell more than you make. And that creates wealth in the long term. Borrowing for consumption over a period of time, it's an excess, usually leads to societies or the governments that do that becoming quote-unquote banana republics. Borrowing for investment or infrastructure or for businesses that make a profit and produce goods, then can support a service economy, in turn can pay taxes and support the governments we need. Again, anything in these statements that rings a bell in you of where we are today, what you see around you. In order to I could talk for hours on this, as speakers, Dr. Weldy and Dr. Cavino said, there's such a broad subject, but I'm going to take one point to make my principles, and that is become oil. And this will emphasize the importance of short and long-term thinking, I believe. Facts. With roughly 3 to 4% of the population of the world, we have at our peak consumed roughly 25% of all the oil in the world. Isn't this something? And yet, at the same time, we talk about wanting to clean up our environment, we talk about wanting to be more efficient and so on. We have the greatest, on this North American continent, we have the greatest resources in fossil fuels, more greater than the rest of the world put together. Now it consists of oil, natural gas, coal, tar sands, and shale. None of them, as we move on along, we've drained the cheap stuff now, and now it's going to cost more. But we do have resources here. We're a very abundant, rich continent. At the peak of before the downturn a few years ago, some of you may remember the figure that we were having a deficit in our balance of payments of roughly $700 billion a year. That works out to about $2 billion a day. That's what we were having to borrow as a nation to other people, China, whatever, in order to basically finance the imports that we were bringing in, the opposite of an export balance of power. Looking back at it, the total imports amounted to $3 billion a day. In other words, all the cheap goods we were getting from China and Asia, the Philippines, India, all of those amounted, they were cheap, lots of them, massive of them, you see everywhere, $1 billion a day. And we were still, in spite of the fact that Germany has best export balance of power, we still produce more export goods at the high end than any other country in the world, by far. So, if it were not for the oil we were importing, we would have had no deficit in our balance of payments for imports versus exports. As I said before, we had an unholy alliance with the Middle East, Europe. We had cheap oil for our tacit support. It's no wonder that we festered a lot of unhappiness amongst the people, and it's no surprise that that is finally breaking out, what we're seeing today. The first energy crisis we had was in the late 70s and early 80s. And OPEC, we started to deal with it, started to move toward energy and water development in many areas. And OPEC dropped the prices, and we forgot about it, and we went back to buying cheap oil and forgetting it. Now, what are the unintended consequences of these things with regard to the short and long-term dealings? We need a military over there in the Middle East to protect our oil supply, because what would happen if that whole area broke up between the Shiites, the Sunnis, and the Turks, and oil supplies were cut off? The world would be short of oil because we're dependent upon it, and our whole economies worldwide would be in trouble. So it means we're having to spend a lot of money protecting our interests, creating overreach, creating a lot of arguments against us being there. We're sending money at the rate we're sending at the peak. It's down now because the price has dropped a bit from where it was at $160 a barrel a few years ago. We're sending a great deal of money, much of it, to Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Venezuela, our loving friends. And what are they doing with it? They're really using it to undermine us. So that money, instead of being used in our country to create jobs and create money to help support the government, create a good and sound economy, which we need, is being there. Now, that doesn't mean that we should be basically counting on those things long term. I'll get to that later. But it is hurting us on the short term. And in the long term, another unintended consequence was that with no long-term plan, we ended up creating mandates for energy efficiency, which really didn't work very well, didn't accomplish much, because we had cheap oil, so why should people worry about mandates to get more efficient cars? We had subsidies that have distorted our economy and haven't, a lot of it's been waste. The one real breakthrough we've had in recent times has been, in the last 5 years, we've had a real breakthrough in the drilling horizontally in the lenses of shale. It took us from a shortage of natural gas to actually a glut 5 years later. And the price of natural gas has dropped by 2/3. One of the unintended consequences of that, along with the thing that happened in Japan recently, is that one of the long-term things we need to move to, nuclear, for clean, sustainable energy, is undermined with what happened in Japan, and also the cheap natural gas. It's really better in the short term to use the natural gas than to take the risk in the longer term on nuclear, which in the long term really has to be a part of what we do. So mandates and subsidies really have not produced very good results. The one thing, and incidentally, The Economist magazine brought these points out a few years ago, and so I've got some background on this. The only real way to influence human nature is through economics. Europe, long ago, and many other countries started putting taxes on oil and gasoline. Today, I can go to Europe and pay twice as much per gallon for my fuel, and it's all taxes. But I get twice the mileage because their automobiles are designed to get better mileage. Japan, Europe, other places. Realize what that did to our automobile industry as the prices went up and down, up and down. People ricochet back and forth between wanting big cars and little cars. How is the automobile? I can throw plenty of criticism against the administrators of the auto industry. But with no government direction and no long-term plan, it's no wonder our automobile, that's another good, strong reason why our automobile industry has been left so far behind in trouble. Unintended consequences of short-term thinking instead of a long-term plan. It's also kept us from preparing toward recognizing that students in this country thought, get a college degree, that's the end of it. You're guaranteed a good job for life.